I'm Lai Leong for the Center of Presidential History. Today is December 17th, 2014, and I'm with Mr. Ernest Z. Bauer at CSIS. Okay. So, Mr. Bauer, can you start by telling me about your background and your involvement in things Southeast Asian?
Sure. I've been working in Southeast Asia for 30 years. I helped build a group called the US-ASEAN Business Council starting in 1986, and I was president of that from 1995 to 2004. And then I started a company called Bauer Group Asia, and that still exists. And I was asked to come here to CSIS to build a Southeast Asia chair in 2009, and so I'm the chair, Sumitro Chair, for Southeast Asian Studies here at the Center for Strategic International Studies and the CEO of Bauer Group Asia. But I've been deeply involved in the U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia for about 3 decades.
Okay. Can you tell me about U.S. government policy towards Southeast Asia in the 1990s, prior to 9/11?
Sure. I think it's a story of two ends of the 90s. In the beginning of the 90s, the United States was very much interested in Southeast Asia because business had boomed and the Asian tigers were in the headlines. Many of the Southeast Asian countries and Taiwan were included in that. So they had growth rates near 10% per year. U.S. investment was peaking. And it was the go-go times of Southeast Asia. That period took place through the 90s until it came to a shuddering halt at the end of the 90s with the advent of the Asian financial crisis, which many attribute to having sort of started in Bangkok and spread quickly to the rest of Southeast Asia and the rest of Asia. Actually, Korea also suffered very badly. And U.S. policy then shifted to a much more, antiseptic sort of engagement. I think the Southeast Asians felt that the Americans really backed off and stood behind the IMF. Our relations with Thailand, for instance, were really damaged by this period, where the Thais felt that even though the United States was a treaty ally, we didn't have a compassionate response to their financial disaster. We're still dealing with the ramifications of that today.
Would you say then that U.S. priorities were very much economic in focus at that time?
I think so. Yes, absolutely. In fact, it was the early 90s were the period of, Ron Brown and as Commerce Secretary, and Southeast Asia. Initially, Indonesia was one of his big emerging markets. Then ASEAN, they changed it to become ASEAN being one of the big emerging markets where the U.S. would focus around the world. And I think in the end of the 90s, from a more negative perspective, crisis management was the focus, but it was very economic in that instance.
Mm-hmm. Where did ASEAN stand in relation to other regions of the world in terms of U.S. priority, you think, at that time?
Well, I think geopolitically, ASEAN was seen as a sort of not too serious. I think there were concerns about other parts of the world that were being taken much more seriously. Russia, China, the rise of China. Southeast Asia wasn't a high priority sort of geopolitically. Economically, yes. Geopolitically, less so. But as we come to later, up to modern history or today, China's rise, and particularly its use of its economic power and its new growing military might has made Southeast Asia much more a focal point than it was in the 90s.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about 9/11.
Okay.
Where were you when 9/11 happened?
I was in Vietnam. Actually, I was on an airplane. I was on an airplane. I was probably the last person, one of the last people, at least Americans, to find out about it. I landed in Bangkok late at night, probably around midnight, and I was staying in the airport hotel there to transit to Hanoi the next day. And at the desk when I checked in, the clerk said, "Please call your wife urgently." It was the last thing you want to hear when you get off a long flight. And I was concerned, something happened with my family or something. So I went quickly to the room and I called my wife, and she said, there's been an attack in New York and the World Trade Center, both towers are down. And I said, "No, come on, don't, it's not funny. I'm really tired." And she said, "No, turn on CNN." And I sat there and I watched the replay of the plane coming into the tower, and just in disbelief. And it was a horrible moment there. But I stayed on the phone with my wife, tried to understand, think about what that meant. I think like everybody. And then I really couldn't sleep that night. But at the first thing in the morning, had to fly to Vietnam for a set of US-ASEAN economic meetings. And then I spent the next week sort of stuck in Vietnam because no flights were being allowed back into the United States. So I was stuck there with John Huntsman, who was then deputy U.S. Trade Representative and was the official rep, and I was leading sort of the business part of the delegation. And we had a lot of time to talk to our partners in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese people, by the way, were so compassionate, and their hearts, everyone you talk to, from a taxi driver to the prime minister, would just, first thing they would say was that we're with you, and we're so sorry about the attacks in New York. And that was actually really nice. But I remember flying back from Vietnam after about a week. We were allowed to fly back, and there were only, it was a very surreal situation. There were only about 3 people in the business class, so a lot of empty seats, and just very solemn and quiet. So it was very a stark memory.
So the meetings that you had, once the news of the attack got through, what were they like? What did the ASEAN businessmen or the people you met, what did they say about this?
Well, we did several meetings with the ASEAN trade ministers. At the advent of every meeting, they would, the Vietnamese chair would say how sorry they were about the attacks, and that ASEAN and Vietnam very much stood with the United States at this time, and this their hearts went out to us as what a tragedy this was. I even remember the woman who was checking people into the hotel, the reception clerk. I still keep in touch with her because she was crying, and she was so sad, that the Americans had been hit like this. And it turns out that her daughter was born on the same day my daughter is born on. So it's that kind of event where someone who you generally would just check in with and move on. I've actually we have a correspondence just because our daughters were born on the same day, and because of the tragic events of that day. And I think that's how in the meetings, the officials, also we formed a very close bond. We were already, I work with these guys a lot anyway, but I think we all recall when we see each other now, that, remember that you were actually in Vietnam with us when 9/11 happened. So it did put a stamp on all of our memories, and in a way, I think it bound us to them even closer.
Mm-hmm. Was there a sense even then among these ministers or people you met as to what they might have anticipated the U.S. doing in response to this event?
I think so. At first, it was just shock. I think over the next couple of days, I think there was a sense that the United States would be some action. I think that this was immediately after. So this was the September 12, September 13, September 14. I think there was a sense that the United States would take some action, and a very, very much a sense of unity, support for a U.S. response. But I don't think anyone at that point knew what the response would be. There had to be I can't recall whether we actually knew much about who did it at that time. Certainly, I mean, I don't think Afghanistan had sort of come into play yet. That maybe at the end of those days, it was started to take a little bit of shape. But I mean, I had the sense, and I think John Huntsman would have the sense that these were good friends, you know, of America and people who would support us at this time. That's the overwhelming sense that I had, and not specifics about what U.S. actions were coming.
Mm-hmm. So in the months that then followed, what was your sense of how U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia might begin to change, if at all?
I think that the initial response was very strong from the ASEAN governments. So calls to the White House, strong support. I think as time went on, there was a sense from the White House, and this would be more than months. This would be a year or 2 years out. That this was a fight, you know, and that it became a little bit of, you know, are you with us? Are you with us in this fight? And actually that became the overwhelming filter in a lot of ways for the White House engagement with Southeast Asia. So, you know, I just remember the president saying, you know, are you with us? Are you know, if you're not with us, you're sort of against us. That was the feeling in Southeast Asia, I think. And I think it hurt some relationships that we had. You know, for instance, the Philippines. George Bush and Gloria Arroyo, who's it was also a daughter of a past president of her country, like President Bush was, a son of a past U.S. president. At the outset of their two presidencies, were very close, and Gloria Arroyo was invited to the White House for a state dinner. I remember sitting right next to her at the state dinner, and then President Bush was on the other side of her, and I remember being shocked to have that seat. You know, it was a great honor. Sandra Day O'Connor was on the other side. I think after 9/11, for several reasons, Gloria Arroyo there were some allegations of corruption in her reelection. There were other factors, but she pulled out of the alliance of the willing, and I think everybody in Southeast Asia was very conscious that the National Security Council and the White House had a folder, you know, sort of, what have you said about the war on terror? Are you with the Americans or not? And several leaders in Asia got on the wrong side of that, and they found. How did they get on the wrong side? Saying the wrong things. You know, there was literally a clipping file that the senior. Or the director for Southeast Asia, the National Security Council, is a good friend of mine, had, and you know, I think Prime Minister Thaksin of Thailand, I recall, you know, said the wrong things, and Thailand started to fall off the group of countries that, you know, were strongly supporting the United States. When in effect, and in truth, as we know, and I knew then, the Thais were actually strongly supporting us, and we were flying sorties from an airbase in northern Thailand into Afghanistan. But there was a real sense of, you know, sort of, either you were politically aligned with the Americans or you weren't, and if you weren't, that affected your entire relationship with us.
Wow. What would be considered the wrong thing?
An
example?
I can't remember exactly what Thaksin said, but something, you know, wondering out loud whether, you know, the American bombing of this or that was the right thing to do at the right time. I don't know if it was about Iraq or Afghanistan. I think the real push came when the war expanded to Iraq. That's when we started to you started to have some questions by leaders in Southeast Asia about the scope of the engagement, and I think there was those who sort of wondered out loud about that, and I think got dinged at the White House, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. It's surprising that you should mention Thailand and the Philippines, because Thailand, as we learned last week from the so-called torture report, actually hosted a black site.
Oh, yeah.
And then the Philippines, of course, had their own Islamic militants in the south.
They did.
So you would think
and they
that,
do, yeah.
Right, and you think that these two countries would be extremely closely aligned with the U.S.
Well, in the Philippines, if you recall, there was a hostage situation. I forget which group took a Filipino hostage, and they part of the deal to get her back was that the president of the Philippines had to sort of renounce her involvement in the coalition of the willing, and she did. And the White House, I think there was a lot of diplomacy urging her not to do that, not to succumb to terrorist kidnapping threats. But because she was politically on the edge in her own country, I think her read of the polls, domestic politics, was that she had no choice. But that didn't go down well here. So, and the other surprising thing, you might note is that of the 10 ASEAN countries, the two who were treaty allies were the Philippines and Thailand. So there was much more unambiguous support, I think, from places like Vietnam, a country we fought a war with, Malaysia, Singapore, and that was interesting too. Malaysia is actually by constitutionally defined as an Islamic country, but for them it wasn't about religion. It was about the Americans, striking back. And Afghanistan, at least. I think when we got into Iraq, it started to be harder. But eventually, as time would carry on, the Malaysians actually joined us in Afghanistan about 6 years ago, and put Malaysian troops into Afghanistan to support the effort. They were medical troops and women specifically who could take care of Islamic women, so that the gender match was there. Very thoughtful, but the Malaysians were strong supporters.
Mm-hmm. What about the Indonesians?
The Indonesians were also supportive, quietly supportive. I mean, they also they're not an Islamic country, but as they have the largest Islamic population in the world. Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. The most Muslims in any country are there. They're very moderate, generally moderate Muslims, and they ended up having their own problem with radicalized Islam. Not all Indonesians, by the way. It turned out that the bombings in Bali and at the I guess it was the Marriott Hotel in Jakarta, which killed a lot of Indonesians, but also killed foreigners, were done by a mix of Indonesians and Malaysians. And so the radicalized Islamic element, I think, was something that the Indonesians responded to in particular. And I think if you look at the history of President Yudhoyono's response to those attacks, it turned out to be very strong, and very capable. And I think Indonesian society rejected that sort of extremism. And so the history of sort of counterterrorism in Indonesia is pretty good. I mean, the very effective work to isolate these people, have them convicted or hunted down in some cases, as they were.
Mm-hmm. How did the Bush administration view the sort of tiptoeing that Megawati had to do in terms of counterterrorism efforts? Because even though they obviously had their radical elements, there was still some tiptoeing going on, was there not?
Yeah, there was. Remember, I think Megawati was here, right? She was. It
was right after.
Right after. She was the first foreign leader to visit Washington after the attacks, I believe. I remember like it was yesterday, her being here and making a speech. But Megawati, I think the Indonesians did feel that they had to be very careful. Even though Megawati, when she was here that week, was very forthright in support of the Americans, and I think the White House really appreciated that. But you're right, she had to be, I think the Indonesians thought they had to be very careful about their support, but I think behind the scenes we all knew that the Indonesians they were dealing with domestic politics at the surface, but behind the scenes I think the Indonesians were pretty supportive, which is interesting too, because we had been through sort of a couple decades of no contact with the Indonesian military over human rights concerns related to Aceh and East Timor. And now today, where we have reestablished mill-to-mill relations with the Indonesians, and things are good. And I think you could argue that the counterterrorism effort was actually which grew in part out of the 9/11 and the response to radical Islam, has been a positive thread in terms of our rapprochement between the United States and the Indonesian military.
Do you have a sense that perhaps, because you did say that U.S. relations with a lot of ASEAN countries sort of ended up taking place through the filter of counterterrorism. Do you feel that that perhaps overshadowed other equally worthy issues in those relationships?
It did, without doubt. I think the lens in Washington was we're at war, and it was a war on terror, and I think the relations with a lot of the Southeast Asian countries was absolutely very much seen through that lens. In fact, I would say throughout the Bush presidency, until President Obama was elected, and still, the Southeast Asians are concerned a bit about, they very much want the Americans involved in the region. They very much want the Americans involved economically. In Asia, economics is the foundation of security, so they would prefer to lead with economics. And I think if the Asians, Southeast Asians, would sort of critique U.S. policy during the Bush years, it was because it was always about security. Security, counterterrorism, radical Islam. Security, counterterrorism, radical Islam. And I think that got to be a bit painful for them, because they wanted to talk more about economics. And this happened in the midst of, they were just coming out of the economic crisis, the Asian economic crisis that started in '98. That's exactly the time China decided to put on what I call the Chinese charm offensive. And China came to Southeast Asia for the first time, providing aid, financial aid, actually money to governments. First time they'd done that. And for a decade and a half, the Chinese, well, not a decade and a half, but for a decade, the Chinese really had this period of free running, because they wanted to talk about economics. They grew to become the largest trading partner with most of the Southeast Asian countries, because their economy was jumping forward. And at a time when the Americans were focused like a laser beam on security, and the Japanese had sort of lost confidence and were going through the economic doldrums, China popped up as the hope, the real savior. I think a key ingredient for most of the Southeast Asians in recovering from the Asian financial crisis. Of course, that ended. The Chinese charm offensive ended in 2009 when the Chinese used their newfound economic power and growing military might to assert their sovereign interest, and drew a 9-dash line around the South China Sea. And I think all of Southeast Asia then started to wonder, wait, who are the Chinese? What do they want? And what do they want to be? Because this is not the friendly face of Beijing that we've seen over the last couple of years. This is them using this leverage, and it's a giant country proximate to all of us. With now we see sovereign interests that overlap with our own claims and interests. So I think that was an interesting part of the developments going on, and remains to be so today.
Right. Would you say then that laser focus on counterterrorism in geopolitical terms cost the U.S.?
Yeah, it did. We hung on to it too long. I think that it took too much of the bandwidth. I think looking back, it's easy to look back and see, how you could have done things better. But we should have broadened the spectrum of our engagement with Southeast Asia. We should have continued to lead with, or continued to emphasize economics. At the same time, we pushed hard on the security discussion. Certainly, we had priorities. I think no one had questions about that. But the other side, or the fullness of the relationship, wasn't emphasized. So I do believe that economics, people-to-people ties, other areas of diplomacy were sacrificed because there was only so much bandwidth. And to be honest, I do believe that U.S. policy towards Southeast Asia is limited a bit by the number of experts that we have. And if you take those experts and you focus them on the president's clear priority, which is going to be counterterrorism, and that's the lens by which countries will be judged, then you don't have a lot of bandwidth to do the other parts of the relationship. And it really invited, I believe, the Chinese into this period of, charming diplomacy, and relative to us, which, a lot of Southeast Asians could understand where the Americans were. It wasn't like we were on Mars or something. They understood that we'd been attacked, but they also have dealt with attacks and insurgencies. As you pointed out earlier, there's radical Islamic attacks in southern Thailand almost every day. Beheadings, bombings, teachers being shot, and it goes both ways. I'm not, picking on one group. Southern Philippines, also true. The Indonesians had their bombings. The Malaysians are very much concerned about this. Even in Singapore, you had Mas Salamat and others threatening the security of Singapore.
What about the fact that Condoleezza Rice didn't show up for some ASEAN meetings?
Yeah, I think Southeast Asia was very upset about this, that the Americans couldn't sort of walk and chew gum at the same time, that repeatedly Condoleezza Rice would be committed to, for the ASEAN Regional Forum and what we call the Post-Ministerial Conference, the PMC, and repeatedly the Middle East would call her away. And this sort of pattern reinforced thinking eventually that the Americans, we're not the top priority for the Americans. That's clear, but it's also understandable because there are wars going on. But I think as the wars expanded from Afghanistan to Iraq, and then particularly U.S. support for Israel, I think that there's a strong theme in Southeast Asia among Muslims that the Palestinians have been persecuted. So I remember Condoleezza Rice not showing up really did cause a lot of pain and ache for particularly the Southeast Asian countries with large Muslim populations. And there were some bad scenes. When she got to Malaysia, I remember one of the young leaders of Malaysia, Khairi Jamaluddin, who's a good friend of mine, he's out with the protests in front of the U.S. Embassy and asking her to challenging her to come out in the street and fight. And I called him and I said, "What are you doing, Khairi? That's lousy. It's you are a guy who could be the Prime Minister of Malaysia one day, and this will haunt you forever. It's unforgivable, that kind of grandstanding, and it does undercut your relationship with the United States. Will for a long time. I haven't forgotten it. People won't forget that. But look, that period, it just cost us a lot of goodwill. It opened the door for, I think, particularly the Chinese drove a truck of charm, through that opening. But now things are sort of returning. President Obama has a policy of pivoting back towards Asia, or rebalancing, and that's what that's about. In some ways, is sort of making up for that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to talk about that just a little bit
Sure,
more
yeah.
later. But
Okay.
right now, just in terms of, I just lost my train of thought. Just in terms of, what about other issues, in terms of human rights or political reform in those countries? Was that affected by the focus too on counterterrorism?
I think so. I mean, Southeast Asia was going through and is continuing to go through a really interesting period of political development because by and large, the major ASEAN countries had sort of gone through a post-colonial experience where strong central leaders took control of these markets. So, and they actually did a pretty good job with economic development. So Lee Kuan Yew, Mahathir, really the king of Thailand, Suharto in Indonesia, Ramos for a while in the Philippines. These guys consolidated power, centralized power. They went for rapid economic growth. They chose winners in a lot of cases. That there was some corruption. I'm generalizing now. Some countries were better, some were not. They built sort of state-owned enterprises to drive their economic plans. And the Americans were relatively supportive of this because it was the Cold War. And, as long as you were doing good economic growth and you weren't, leaning towards communism, pretty good, keep it up. And so a lot of these guys ran their countries for decades. And at this exact period, and when 9/11 happened, Southeast Asia was starting to change, right? So because of the Asian financial crisis, I think the Asian financial crisis tested sort of those incumbent leaders, the big, I call them the great men of Southeast Asia. They were tested because they had been so successful economically, and they'd built, with their positive economic policies, a middle class that had high expectations of their government, higher expectations of their governments. So they wanted delivery of services, they wanted transparency, they wanted human rights, they wanted a say in governance. And they were starting to really push. And the Asian financial crisis toppled Suharto directly. It was in part a result, the Mahathir stepped down, not because of the Asian financial crisis. He hung on through that, but I think he realized that it was time to call the shot on his own and move on. Lee Kuan Yew had been transitioning out, and Goh Chok Tong had taken over for him. Obviously, Marcos was long gone in the Philippines, and that process started there in '86, of course. And Thailand, to this day, is just going through their transition. The king is 87 years old, and we're actually seeing Thailand's Suharto moment now, which is pretty fascinating. But anyway, the point is that Southeast Asia was at a critical political juncture, sort of an inflection point that I actually would argue stretches to today, because now they're consolidating. But to think that today a Jokowi could be elected in Indonesia from outside of the power structure, he's not part of the powerful families of Indonesia. He's not from the military. Was born, in Solo, and was a furniture entrepreneur there. And because of delivery of services in his experience as mayor of Solo, there was a groundswell for him. And I also think Noynoy Aquino in the Philippines also fits this mold. A guy who did not want to be president, but was sort of conscripted almost because he didn't want to be. And the Southeast Asians are looking, and this will affect politics, by the way, in Malaysia and Indonesia, or Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore even. You have the development of a viable opposition. Not that Lee Kuan Yew's party, PAP, will not be in power anytime soon, but in the last election they actually lost 6 seats, which in Singapore was like a political revolution in a way. But I think it's because Singaporeans want to have more of a discussion. They they know what's going on in the world. They have access to technology and ideas, and that's true all around Southeast Asia. So these trends were taking place at this time, and I think the Americans missed a lot of it because we had sort of a one focus, and we didn't miss all of it, but we I think our policy was too narrow in retrospect, and you know, I think we've sort of caught up with that now. That we're lucky in a way, because had the Chinese continued with the Charm Offensive, had they not decided to draw the 9-dash line around the South China Sea, I think Southeast Asia could be very much in a mode of sort of following Chinese encouragement for a Sinocentric ordering of Asian economy, of the Asian economic integration, and you know, I think you could go. I don't want to go too far on that point, because I think Southeast Asians have a natural affinity for the United States. The Americans really do have soft power there, and I think even though we were hitting the gas too hard on and too long on sort of security only, there is a feeling in Southeast Asia that the Americans will always be needed for balance, whether China was being charming or, in the case of what we see now, aggressive and sort of scary. I think Southeast Asia's inherent desire geopolitically is for balance. So if we were going, you know, if we were focused like a laser beam on Southeast Asia and other countries weren't, I think they would be looking to China and India for balance. And when I started in this business in the mid-'80s, the ASEANs would come to Washington and say, we need you because the Japanese are too focused and are overbalancing and out-investing you, and they have plans that dominate our economy. So there was an interest then in having the Americans involved, and that interest now is really illuminated by an overly aggressive and sort of opaque China.
Mm-hmm. I had the good fortune of speaking to a former administration official who was in the Bureau for Democracy and Human Rights.
Oh, good.
And he makes the claim that President Bush was actually very focused on democracy building in the lead up to the second inaugural address, but especially after the second inaugural address, where he talks about, you know, democracy and so on. And he claims credit, perhaps not surprisingly, for some of the sort of democratic changes and transitions that we see in the world. He didn't mention Southeast Asia specifically, but since you were talking about, you know, those transitions going on, would you agree that the Bush administration perhaps doesn't get enough credit for that?
I would say this. I think there is a high degree of continuity in our Asia policy, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, over the last 20 years. So there's a lot of continuity, actually. But I would have to say, and President Bush was interested in democracy and human rights. I'm thinking of, you know, his senior directors for Asia at the National Security Council, and one of whom is my colleague Mike Green here. And Laura Bush was at the end of the Bush years became the sort of a leading voice on human rights and democracy for Myanmar. So I don't think that they did nothing on that front at all. I think that if you ask Southeast Asians, though, the Bush period was sort of unambiguously about security. It was about geopolitics related to the security issues. It was not about economics or human rights or democracy. I think that would be the Southeast Asian view.
Do you get a sense that there was perhaps internal debate or tension over this policy? Again, the same official I spoke to said, you know, we had clear directives coming from the White House, you know, that we do want to stress democracy, we do want to stress human rights, but when it comes down to the implementation level, within the State Department, well, it wasn't always the case because they wanted to do something else. Do you get a sense that there was some tension?
Yeah, I think there's always tension, and I do think I know President Bush. I heard him speak. I think he genuinely was interested in democracy and human rights. But this is a question of priorities and resources, and I think I made the case earlier. There's limited bandwidth, right? So, well, I'm not surprised that someone was in charge of the Democracy and Human Rights Bureau would have that view that we were promoting, these issues. I think probably from his perch, yes, that's what he was doing. The question is, at the other end, for your partners in Southeast Asia, did they feel that that was your priority? I would say my answer was no. Not that we weren't for human rights and democracy, but that if you were an ambassador at that time, I don't know if you've interviewed those guys yet, but I think they would argue that there was a range of interests that they were trying to promote in countries. But at the end of the day, the bottom line was, where are you with us in relation to this fight? And I think that's because the Americans were really on sort of a wartime footing, and that's what was going on at the time.
What about from the perspective of not the governments in Southeast Asia, but in terms of civil society groups? Do you have a sense of what they saw, what they thought at that time?
The Southeast Asian civil society groups?
Right.
I think they were very focused on, and I referred to this earlier, on their own fight. I mean, I think in a lot of these countries, this was the great opportunity. I mean, think about Indonesia. Suharto stepping down. So then you had B.J. Habibie and Gus Dor and Megawati finally, the opposition leader for all those years being elected. I think they were very much caught up in their own stories, their domestic stories. Malaysia, I would argue the same. They were, it was Mahathir versus Anwar, then Mahathir, stepping down, Abdullah, Badawi, and I remember very sharply working on, President Bush tried to go to Malaysia. No president since Lyndon Johnson had been to Malaysia, and Bush wanted to go to Malaysia. The White House tried 4 times, but civil society groups in Malaysia were at that time had become very anti-war, particularly around Iraq, and they were upset about the plight of the Palestinians. And 4 times it was, there were different elements, but 4 times the basic story was, maybe don't come now, because the story will be, anti-Bush, anti-Americanism, which is not the story the Malaysians wanted. Politically, they did not want that headline, protests line streets and, Bush being burned in effigy while he was there. So the Malaysians were carefully managing this with us, that, they didn't want those pictures. Other countries sort of had a different view. I mean, if you remember when President Bush went to Indonesia, it was a carefully planned meeting with civil society groups and religious leaders, where he sat down and took his coat off and sat on the ground and sort of, talked to them about Islam, moderate Islam, and that was a very important picture. It's the way the Indonesians managed that issue, and I think it helped, but there was still, I think, in terms of the main bandwidth of civil society groups in the region, it was about their own stories. When they thought of America, it had started to move towards, there was, I think, a strong tinge of sort of anti-Americanism building, a response to what they saw as unilateralism. The Southeast Asians were shocked. I remember when we re-elected President Bush, I got calls, from a lot of civil society leaders in particular saying, like, who are you guys? Like, you fought that war and, you're going to perpetuate it. And I think my answer to them at the time was, guys, you have to be, here. I mean, you have to have been part of that feeling that, when we were attacked. I think Americans are still anxious about it. And they want leadership who's focused on this. And I think Bush was he was in touch with where the core of Americans were, certainly enough to get, reelected with a pretty clear mandate, I thought. But by the time his term was over and the next election was coming, I think if Southeast Asians could have voted for president, they would have voted for Obama because from their perspective, he was about not going unilateral, multilateral, reaching out to the world to build consensus, not, deciding what was right for America and sort of inflicting that on others. And so they were really excited, Southeast Asia in general, with the exception of maybe the Singaporeans, not so much. They liked the Republicans' view. They liked a hardcore practical view of geopolitics. I think the Filipinos also. If you did polling, and I was looking at polling, I remember at the time, I think the Singaporeans and the Filipinos were pretty strong on Bush. The rest of the region would have voted, with the Democrats and elected, Obama. And they had very high hopes for him. And I think it's interesting that now, as he's going out, they found that he, could have been the right guy, but he never followed through really on the hope that they had that he would be, having grown up in Indonesia and been born in Hawaii and has, described himself as the first Pacific president. He's made the meetings for the most part. He missed one last November over the budget crisis, but he hasn't been able to follow through on the economic piece of it. And I think the Southeast Asians find themselves looking now for an American who will in a way, go back to that more practical view of geopolitics, really stand up to the Chinese, hold their feet to the fire on rule of law, and stop this sort of, they call it salami slicing or cabbage approach to pushing out Chinese interests in the neighborhood beyond the first and second island chain, which is impinging on Southeast Asian sovereignty. So it's really interesting, actually.
Mm-hmm. How did the Bush administration has been, in some circles, criticized, but characterized as approaching U.S.-Southeast Asian relations in a bilateral fashion as opposed to a multilateral fashion? Mm-hmm. What do the ASEAN countries think of that?
I think they're split on it, to be honest with you. I think that's true. That's true. I mean, some of the guys who were running that policy are here at CSIS with me, and I think there is a strong view that treaty alliances, those bilateral relationships, are the most important relationships. That makes sense to me. But there was, I think, a real tangible feeling that ASEAN was too loose. It wasn't practical. You couldn't get sort of results-oriented responses out of ASEAN. They couldn't respond as a unit, for instance, or as a group to the war on terror. It had to be, different countries had different views on it, and very much at that time they were looking for, are you with us or not? And so ASEAN was never going to be able to answer that question. So I think that's a fair criticism of the Bush policy. I think Obama has done more in terms of, and particularly I think Hillary Clinton saw that ASEAN, because of the fact that it's a large grouping, 10 countries, 620 million people, $2+ trillion GDP, but it doesn't have a national identity. So it doesn't have the sort of sovereign concerns and political a domestic political edge that a China would, or even in India. But because it is a political entity within Asia, it's the place where I think Hillary Clinton got this right. She said strategically we can build regional architecture around ASEAN, and ASEAN would be the fulcrum of new 21st century security and economic architecture. She's right about that. That actually makes a lot of sense, and it's dawning on these guys now that, yeah, actually that's right, because the ASEAN being strong is important, but the fact that it doesn't have sort of a sovereign consensus, it just never would, by definition, actually does make it the place where we can meet and compete and come to consensus with ideas. So if the great game of the 21st century is going to be to convince China to make the rules with the neighborhood and then play by those rules, really, an ASEAN-centric geopolitical strategy, which combines the Pacific and Indian Oceans, makes a lot of sense. And I think the Bush guys just they were doing other things. They just didn't have that sort of a scope in mind, and they didn't have the tolerance to put up with those big soft ideas. They were looking very transactionally at military relationships, benefits you get from alliances. What can we do out of Okinawa? What can we do from Udon Thani in northern Thailand? What can we base in the Philippines? And I think that made a lot of sense, actually. Very practical. And maybe I think you could criticize the Obama administration as sort of not being too theoretical, too ideological, in Asia, that they have good ideas, but they don't follow through well on them, and they've sort of missed the point that I made earlier, which is that economics is the foundation for security in Asia. So we, it's sort of like Goldilocks. I think under Bush it was too heavy on security and sort of transactional politics that were related, and diplomacy related to a wartime footing. And I think Obama swung the pendulum too far in the other way, which is just too intellectual, too ideological. Good ideas, but not implemented well. Hopefully we can find a president who will, come somewhere in the middle and be very geopolitically practical, be sort of tough-minded, but also be able to deliver and implement. And to do that, what we need in the United States is a leader, a president who will talk to Americans about why Asia is important, and build a domestic political foundation in the United States, so that guys who are working in factories or are teachers or truck drivers will say, hey, actually the stuff I'm driving around on trucks comes more and more from Asia, and the things I'm building in factories get sold in Asia, or their inputs come from Asia, and then we sell the final good in Asia, and school teachers understand that innovation and our security is coming from Asia. So it's not a hard speech to make. I don't know why President Obama, of all people, hasn't made this speech, because he grew up in Indonesia and he speaks Bahasa. He gets it, but he's politically unwilling to build that foundation here. But when a U.S. leader starts to talk to Americans about why Asia is important to their future and their children's future and their security, then Asia will know. And that's what they're looking for, that we've really pivoted and that we're rebalancing towards Asia. But so far, not yet. Mm-hmm. Nobody yet.
During the Bush administration, do you get a sense that the Bush policymakers really had a very simplistic view of Islam and Islamic militants in Southeast Asia? No,
I don't think so. These were really smart guys. I mean, at the sort of Asia policy level, they had a sophisticated understanding of religious Islam. I think what moderate Islam was. I think there was at least a surface understanding, that Indonesia was quantitatively or qualitatively different, in the way it viewed Islam from, sort of militants in southern Philippines or southern Thailand or even some of the Malaysians. So I thought there was a fairly nuanced and sophisticated understanding of that. And we had good ambassadors who understood these things. So no, I don't think we missed that, or the Bush administration would have missed that.
Right. So you wouldn't agree then that, because there were some people who said, well, some of these governments sort of took advantage of the so-called second front, the Bush calling Southeast Asia a second front on the war against terror, that some of the governments in Southeast Asia took advantage of that to, in order to put down their sort of domestic Muslim militants or rebels.
Well, I mean, that I actually saw it in a more practical sense. I think there were some problems, right? The Indonesians really did have some radical cells, and I think they did absolutely, Megawati and then SBY after her, absolutely did use U.S. support to go after these guys in counterterrorism cooperation. Yes, the Thais, would have used that script to sort of press forward on the southern insurgency. Very counterproductive, and in the end, it actually drew a huge wedge between Thaksin and the Bush administration because of an issue that ended up being called extrajudicial killings. But you might recall that Thaksin's police-led focus on southern Thailand ended up in a horrific slaughter of Thai Islamic, so quote unquote militants. I don't know. I mean, they were actually stacked in the back of trucks, and dozens and dozens suffocated from that, sort of horrible handling of them. And I think the Bush administration did sort of lean on a human rights and position there. Well, they started to lose confidence in Thaksin. And this was part of the reason that he had really clamped down on them, the southern Islamic faction. So I don't know. I think some governments may have used that, but I think it wasn't a carte blanche, from the White House to do so. And Thailand would be Exhibit A for me. That really did cause a problem in the Bush-Thaksin relationship, and it's where things started to go sour, and probably at about the same time, although I'd have to check my timelines, that Thaksin started to talk out loud about wondering about whether he needed to be supporting Bush in Iraq, and then that sort of the relationship went down from there.
Why do you think Thailand, of all places, would have been the location for one of these black sites?
Well, we had a treaty alliance with the Thais. The U.S.-Thai military relationship was very operational, very practical, very deep, and there was a long history there. Remember that the Americans and the Thais collaborated very effectively during the Vietnam War. So we had a habit and we had invested in joint training with the Thais. We knew who they were. We had access to air bases there. We do still. So I think when the need was there, the Thais were more than willing to be part of that.
What happened when the scandal in Abu Ghraib came out into the open? What were the responses of Southeast Asians to that?
I think it really they had the biggest influence in countries with Islamic populations. I think it was seen as there started to be real questions about the United States standing on Islam, and I think it also undercut our talking points in our foreign policy on human rights and democracy. Having those stories come out was just sickening for those of us engaged in diplomacy with Southeast Asia, and I think we've seen another round of that, by the way, with some of the the WikiLeaks and now the CIA torture report. If the Americans are serious about democracy and human rights, you have to practice what you preach, right? And I think I personally believe that it's who we are and what we do is vitally important to our success or failure in Asia diplomacy for the rest of the century. And because of the argument that I made earlier, that Southeast Asia's civil society, its middle class, is really taking over. They will have a much bigger voice in these governments, and they have access to this information. We will lose credibility, and I think we did lose a lot of credibility at Abu Ghraib. So it was a hit. It was a hit to us, not only among Islamic populations, but generally in a Southeast Asia that looks and will look to us more, I think, in the future, because the other model that they'll be facing is the Chinese model. The Chinese are offering, an economic-based, reward system for letting the Chinese sort of be in charge of ordering Asia economically, and the Chinese would like to, I think, do so sort of politically and have a bigger role. But the Southeast Asians don't want to be China. No one in Southeast Asia aspires to have the Chinese political system. They might want their wealth and their trade and genuinely like Chinese people and want to participate with them in Asian innovation and arts and culture. All that stuff is good, but politically, no. There's no interest there. But the Americans, if we continue to allow things like Abu Ghraib and the CIA torture report, coming out, or the torture itself is the issue. It really undercuts offering a credible alternative.
Mm-hmm. So if we might pull back, because we only have a few more minutes,
okay,
and just talk about what you think, your assessment of what the Bush administration got right and what it did not. What would you say these are?
I think everybody in Asia thought that the Americans should do something. We were hit by 9/11, and that it took real resolve and leadership to respond to that. And I think history will show, and the Southeast Asians feel, that George Bush stepped up to that. He was a leader. Did he focus on those issues too long? Yeah, probably. But I think that what Bush did right was he was clear. I think he led a credible American response in the big picture to what happened at 9/11. I think in retrospect, the Southeast Bush would go down as someone who the things he did right were the immediate response. Afghanistan, I think there would be questions about Iraq, and then in general, I think the view was that not enough consultation or deep enough engagement in Asia to build consensus, to maybe even do more than he did.
What about in terms of long-term implications for the Obama presidency? You mentioned, of course, China.
Yeah.
Are there other long-term implications that the U.S. is still grappling with because of the Bush policy?
I think so. I think one that I would point out would be the security-led engagement of Asia. It has created much more space than needed for the Chinese. So we need to balance that. To this day, I cannot name for you, who's in charge of economic strategy for the United States. It's not the U.S. trade representative, because Mike Froman is a really smart guy, but he's in charge of trade negotiations, and his mandate at USTR comes from the Congress, because they're negotiating trade treaties, and treaties have to be approved by the Congress. It's not the Commerce Department, because Penny Pritzker is promoting trade and doing other things, but that's not strategy. So I don't see anyone in the United States to this day driving economic strategy in Asia. And I think that will go down in history as a major geopolitical mistake, and I think something that the next president has to correct very quickly.
Do you have a sense that Southeast Asia has a place in U.S. grand strategy at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has actually a very central role. And unfortunately, I think Hillary Clinton was the one who sort of got this. And then when she left the scene, I assumed that it was Obama administration policy. Now I think it may have been Hillary Clinton's view, but I actually think it was right. The grand strategy for Asia is don't go put your nose right up to the Chinese nose and try to either work things out in a sort of a G2, we can agree on this and that and everything, we can sort of drive the globe based on our agreement. The Chinese didn't buy that. That Obama tried that in his first trip to Asia. They saw Obama as weak, and I think the Chinese see Obama as even weaker now. So that they see weakness in Washington as an opportunity to push forward in Asia. But Hillary Clinton saw a different strategic construct, which was instead of taking on China, bilaterally, either in a positive sense or a competitive sense, broaden the chessboard. And so what she did right in terms of Southeast Asia was, if you look at the things she got into office, and really she signed the Treaty of Amity and cooperation with ASEAN. She started the ASEAN summits with President Obama, normalized relations with Myanmar so we could sit down with the 10 ASEAN countries. All of this was not just because that was a good idea itself, but she wanted to build a broader chessboard where it's with Southeast Asia at the center, the prospect of bringing in the Indians over time as additional ballast, and with the grand construct of convincing China over time that, look, in your to be successful, to be safe, to be secure, if you're Beijing, you need to work with the neighborhood, and the Americans included, a broad neighborhood, the Indo-Pacific, to make rules and then play by those rules. And I think that's hard work because ASEAN is diverse, and it's but you need to strengthen ASEAN, work with your allies in Japan, Australia, Korea, and the Philippines and Thailand. You need to bring India into the play, and you need to stay with it, with the Chinese. And I think that geostrategic construct is the one that will eventually be very successful in the 21st century. We haven't had the right combination of leaders who get it and then will implement it. So frustrating, but we have the pieces in place, so we're not far off. If I was grading the United States, I would give us a C+, and I'd say it wouldn't be hard to move up to a B+ or an A-.
So if I might end with the preview question that I mentioned at the start of the interview.
Right.
Could you suggest an episode or a story that might illustrate for us, the notion of how Southeast Asians responded to or engaged with the United States during the period of the Bush presidency, that might illustrate either their attitude or their criticism?
I think the fact that Megawati Sukarnoputri was the first foreign leader to come to Washington after 9/11 illustrated, I think, very, very well the fact that Southeast Asia understood the American need to respond, but it also her ambiguity about what that war on terror actually meant when it was manifested was actually a very good indicator of how Southeast Asia had to cope with the Bush years, which was, they were changing. Southeast Asia was changing. Its domestic politics were absolutely at an inflection point. They had to listen to domestic political concerns about whether the United States was being anti-Islamic or unilateral. At the same time, leaders understood that geopolitically that Bush was a leader who had to take action, and he had to go into Afghanistan. I think Iraq was more of a question, but that there was strong sort of practical support for Bush and the Americans. Some of it really heartfelt because of what we were dealing with, but that eventually, by the end of Bush's time, they were all ready for him to pass the baton because they needed to move from a sort of a geopolitical, practical implementer to someone who would give them more space to develop their economies and domestic political evolution. And I think they hoped Obama would give them that space.
Okay, well, thank you so very much.
Thank you.